Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining another episode of the Frank Figliuzzi Show. As always, we've got a great guest and probably not enough time to ask her all the questions that I want to ask and you want to hear. But let's get into it. Let's talk about how I met Dr. Dominique Roe-Sepowitz. It was researching my latest book, Long Haul, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, about serial killers who are long-haul truck drivers who prey upon mostly trafficked victims. And as I researched my book, the name of our guest just kept popping up, and I knew I had to reach out, call her, and then ultimately visit her in Arizona and see the incredible work she does. Real quickly, she's a professor at the School of Social Work at Arizona State University and director of the ASU Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research. She's got her master's degree, her PhD. And look, if you think you've heard something about this topic with regard to special events, sporting events, and particularly the Super Bowl and trafficking, it's because you're probably hearing about Dr. Dominique Roe-Sepowitz's research. Let's bring her on and start the conversation. Hi, Doctor.
Hello.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having
me.
me.
Good to see you again. Let's start with the topic that's kind of top of mind right now, because the World Cup is coming to America, and 11 cities particularly throughout, from Seattle to Miami and New York and Boston and Philadelphia, Kansas City, San Francisco, LA, and more. And there's a lot that's going to go on our TV screens and in those stadiums that we're all going to see, but there's so much that's going on behind the scenes with social organizations, with police departments, and that's where trafficking and special events comes in. Can you fill us in on the amazing research you really started, I think, with regard to the Super Bowl and trafficking?
Sure. There's a bunch of conversations about human trafficking and Super Bowls and big events. Part of it is about how the places and spaces are created for those special events, right? Is there labor exploitation? Who's building those? That's one conversation. The other conversation tends to be about sex trafficking. Are girls and women brought into those venues, those cities, for the purpose of the pleasure of men to buy sex from them? And does it happen more often during those events? NASCAR, Super Bowl, golf events, and so on. And so what our research found, we did it over about a 10-year period, very intensely for 2 Super Bowls, found that there was not an enormous leap for a couple of different reasons. One, each community of these 10 communities is talking about trafficking now before the games start. That means enforcement has started, eyes on the field, and traffickers know that. They know that around those special events, people are paying attention, and they're likely to go elsewhere during those events now, which is a great deterrent. We appreciate that very much. The problem that remains, though, is in each of those 11 cities, trafficking happens every single day. Local victims, local traffickers sell to local people every single day. So men, money, events, all predictive of having a little bit more trafficking, but the reality is it's every single day in every single city.
So the headlines we've been seeing, headlines about what Miami-Dade's doing, what Seattle's doing, you think, you're observing that you think there's a deterrent effect that it has?
I think there's kind of a give and take. There's a deterrent effect in the sense that the community is much more aware. When the Super Bowl came to Phoenix in 2023, we trained 5,000 volunteers. So many more people knew about the risk factors for trafficking, to look at relationships with people walking into the venue. But they took that knowledge to their church, to the restaurants they frequented, to the parks. And so the awareness in my community went way, way up around that special event. And so that's happening in all those 11 cities. And again, we're really grateful for the attention to it. The problem that we run into is when those games leave, does that attention wane? Does the resources for victims, dry back up? In all those 11 cities, they didn't all have trafficking specific resources until now.
Back when you started looking at the Super Bowl, and one of the great things I enjoy about your work is you're not just an academic. You are in the field. You are a clinician, and you went into the field for the Super Bowl in at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. Tell us about that and what you were looking for and what you found.
So as a researcher, I work with a bunch of different police departments. Right now, my relationships are with the Tucson Police Department, the Phoenix Police Department, and the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. And their work is really, really important to the field of human trafficking. And what we learned from New York, right before the Super Bowl in 2014, the New York area made a decision that they weren't going to wait for the Super Bowl to happen. They were going to arrest as many people as they could who were in prostitution situations. They were just going to shut down the business the most they could, which showed that they were active. But what they didn't necessarily do was have resources for those over 100 women that they arrested that night before the Super Bowl. So what we do with law enforcement is we ask them to be innovative. We try to be creative and thoughtful in our partnerships between social services and law enforcement. And there are many ways that we can innovate without arresting a person in prostitution. What we know about people in prostitution is 9 out of 10 of them were trafficked as a child or are being trafficked now. So when we think this is sex work, that we think that it's independent, that is simply incorrect. So what we do in our community is we work with law enforcement in a bunch of different ways. Once a month, we do a no arrest night with them. When they do a sting with law enforcement, pretends that they're buying sex, and people selling sex will come to a hotel. And instead of being arrested, we'll wrap them around with services. We also 4 times a month or 5 times a month go into the jail after arrests for prostitution and provide direct services to those persons being arrested for prostitution. Again, 9 out of 10 of them are being trafficked or were trafficked as a child. So we're able to bring that information right to them, exiting opportunities. And that's our most important goal, is to not arrest people, but to give them a different path.
For sure.
In 2020,
I spent 25 years with a gun and a badge. And so, you would think that I would tell you, hey, arrest is the way to go, but it's absolutely not. And in fact, I've seen successful partnerships in my own FBI career with groups that you're affiliated with and others that come alongside and not only train the sheriffs and the police officers to say to a trafficking victim, you're not under arrest tonight.
Right.
What do you need to get out of this right now? Right. And then here comes all of the service offers that you've mentioned. That works the most. And then once you develop that trust, maybe law enforcement gains some intel on who is doing the trafficking. That's where the FBI would come in my observation. And so you said a couple of things that are very interesting and I bear repeating, which is, I think so many Americans have an image of what they call sex work from the movies, and particularly the movie with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, Pretty Woman, and that it's glamorous and it's lucrative and that it's done independently. And tell us again how wrong that is statistically.
What we find in our work, we survey women who are in jail, in prison here in Arizona. We work with our community of young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds, and we find that the vast majority, 9 out of 10, are in that situation because they have no other choices. Either they're being forced to do it, maybe they're traffickers in jail and they have to keep doing it to keep up the life that they have and give them the money that they owe them each day, their quota. We work with child victims who are as young as 11 or 12. We have victims who are in their 60s still being trafficked. So when we glamorize this idea that sex is for sale, we really miss this opportunity to say, if someone is in a situation where they're selling sex, what are the other things that are pushing them that direction? And the reality is none of us want our daughters, our mothers, our sisters to be in a situation where they have to sell sex for someone else. And so if we aren't willing to put our loved ones in that situation, how can we kind of sit back and glamorize it and really not understand the complexity of it?
You mentioned juveniles and how this often starts at a very young age. And I think even some of your special event research was looking for kind of the language around advertisements for sex that clued you in a kind of algorithmic way as to, hey, this person more likely than not is a juvenile that's being trafficked, or this is an adult that's being trafficked. Tell us about that kind of research and how it's being applied in the field by police departments.
Absolutely. So we do research with Las Vegas Metro Police Department, super smart, super innovative police department, really at the cutting edge of innovation. And what we learn from that work is that out of thousands of cases of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, traffickers are specialists. They work with either children or adults. There's rarely traffickers that do both, which is pretty important because that determines how you do your policing, how you approach it, and also how we design our services. They're very, very clever in their approach to figure out who traffickers are. What we really want to do is show victims that the community cares about them. And the best way we do that is actually to arrest and incarcerate their offenders. So when we look for minors, we look online, we look on social media, we look on the street. Law enforcement is out there making sure that if they identify someone and we want to know if they're a child, that we can identify that. Some important things, though, that there is a pretty big distinction between trying to buy sex from a 6-year-old and trying to buy sex from a 14-year-old. And so we seem to be looking for sort of different predators. So pedophiles or prepubescent adolescents, people who are attracted to that age group is kind of a different group than what we work with in sex trafficking. Those are child abusers, child sexual abusers, and predators. Those people who are buying sex from children, and they don't really care if they're 18 or 15, right? They're just looking for someone to buy sex from. That tends to be the group that we're looking, those sex buyers that we're looking for. Traffickers, on the other hand, are opportunistic. They're going to figure out whoever they can sell, whatever that looks like. They'll sell, anyone in their life. These are people with very little restraint about how much harm they do to other people.
So lots of parents and grandparents are watching right now and are likely concerned or are thinking, well, this is fascinating, but it doesn't happen in my community or my family or my circle. And so what is your research? And it's not, when I say research, I mean, you are talking face to face with victims of trafficking. And we'll get into that in a while, what you're doing about it. But what do we need to be aware of? What does the grooming look like? Who falls into the trap of trafficking? Is it one socioeconomic class or race? What's going on?
So what we know about vulnerability is that traffickers are looking for that opportunity to find someone. Lots and lots of young people, lots of young adults who maybe aren't having the best life, right? Maybe they're using drugs and alcohol. Maybe they have really hard relationships at home. They're going to go through their whole life. Maybe it's not perfect, but unless a trafficker finds them, they're just going to live their life. What we are worried about as a community is that trafficker finding those vulnerable people. So vulnerable people are people who are unsupervised, who are on social media unsupervised, who are at the park alone, at the mall alone, at a coffee shop, and that they don't have the skills to deter that trafficker, that they're looking for the affection and the attention. Let me tell you, traffickers do not approach a young person and say, I'm going to go sell you on the street. I'm going to make you have sex with 50 guys in the next week. You're not going to want to do it. They start with, what do you need, baby girl? What are you looking for? What are the things that are you missing in your life? What are your goals? What are your hopes? And so it's this really interesting pattern strategy, and it looks a lot like dating violence. It starts with this affection, this connection that I'm so special and he's paying attention to me or she, and then it turns into this cajoling and coercion. Well, if you would just do this for me, right? If you could just do these couple of things for me, I still love you, no one will know. And then it turns into a different situation. What we know is that those traffickers are not the boogeyman. They're not jumping out of bushes. They are people known to that young person. They might be their soccer coach. Right. They might be a person in their church. They might be a relative. About 20% of victims that we work with talk about their being a sibling or a cousin or their dad. And the other 80% are people that they've met before. Maybe they've known on social media for a few weeks. Yeah. They're never a person who jumps out of the corner and grabs them and kidnaps them. We see that so little. Unfortunately, that's what the community thinks it is. And so we're protecting ourselves from the boogeyman instead of protecting our kids from really understanding what it is.
That's important to know, because I think we teach our kids so much about so-called stranger danger, but when it comes to trafficking, it is someone likely on the periphery of their existing network, a friend of a friend, a relative, something like that, like you said. And increasingly today, you mentioned the shopping mall, but we've got kids online, 20 hours out of the day. What is it happen? Does it also happen online? And is that where advertising has moved as well?
It happens both in person and online. We see it in gaming. We had an 11-year-old here that was being recruited on one of the gaming websites where you meet other people to play games. We see it on OnlyFans where people are selling sexual images or videos. It's in any venue that a person has contact with another and can get their identifying information. So it can be random phone calls, it can be social media, it can be gaming, it can really be anywhere. What we do see in more rural communities, though, is that it's more face-to-face, right? They have to have access to that person to put them in that sex selling situation. And so eventually it comes offline and goes into all the different ways that a person is sold for sex. So online, on social media, on dating websites, on the street, in clubs, in strip clubs, in hotels. And so it's such a complicated, hidden world of trafficking, and prostitution is part of all of it. What is also interesting, and I think the FBI link is so interesting, is that if you can convince a person to have sex and give you the money and really be beholden to you and really be under your control, you can get them to commit other types of crimes. I work with a really close friend of mine has robbed 2 banks for her trafficker. We've worked with people who ran drugs across the border, and it's under that person's control. So if you have control of someone, they'll do anything you ask. So we're worried about the prostitution and the risk of that, but we're also worried about all these other crimes they're coerced into committing. And then we're running into them when we're doing our jail and prison work. And they're like, listen, I didn't want to rob that guy. I didn't shoot him. I was just in the room. Yeah, I lured him in the room, but I had to, or I was going to get hit and hurt or sexually assaulted.
Yeah. Wow. So trafficking adjacent crime and the myth that we're talking about prostitution as a victimless crime. It's not my problem. And there's just a whole environment of crime that goes around it. You mentioned that victims need to feel a sense of justice and that people are being held accountable. We're all talking about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. And have you had people you work with say, I don't feel like there is accountability, or how at all, if at all, has that impacted the Epstein case impacted what you're seeing?
So holding traffickers accountable is a really important piece of recovery for victims, whether they're going to participate in the criminal justice system, to testify against their trafficker, whether they're going to come forward and even put the name trafficking on their experience. We work with hundreds and hundreds of people a year. I've worked with over 3,500 survivors of trafficking, and most of them didn't use the language of trafficking. Most of them didn't really understand that had happened. Maybe they thought it was domestic violence or dating violence, but really understanding that sexual exploitation is really important, right? If we have an illness, a fever, we're not feeling well, and someone gives us a name for what happened to us, suddenly we have a lot more power and control of our future. So for our clients, some of it is based on awareness. What has happened to me? What's it called? But then they say, like, he got away with it. He never got in any trouble. I told law enforcement, they didn't believe me, or I told law enforcement, but I had just been beaten and sexually assaulted, and maybe I didn't get my story straight, and so they never even talked to me again. And so we see in different communities. I do a bunch of research right now in Hawaii, and they've had 3 trafficking cases follow all the way through to conviction ever. Their law in Hawaii.
That's all in the entire history of Hawaii. They've had 3 cases.
And the Trafficking Victim Protection Act passed in the year 2000 as the Palermo Protocol now internationally passed. And Hawaii waited until 2016 to pass their state law, where most other states were before them. That was the very last state. So there was this sort of lack of effort as a state to show victims that A, this is important to us, we're going to put it on our state books, and then B, there seems to be some limited effort into holding traffickers accountable. So will a victim come forward if they have never seen a trafficker prosecuted? That is very, very unlikely. In Arizona, we prosecute about 40 traffickers a year, very aggressive, long-term sentences, over 180 years for some of them, big sentences. Our survivors in our community come forward and say, look, I saw my girlfriend's pimp. He got put up for a really long time. I'm ready to come forward and get my trafficker held accountable. So what's happening in the Jeffrey Epstein case, it's so important, is that all those victims who are putting themselves at risk, showing their faces, telling their stories, none of them are receiving justice. None of them are hearing he's going to go to jail for what he did, or prison, he's going to be held accountable for. And so what we're seeing in our community is victims saying, like, well, if they can't do it and they're standing in front of Congress and they have all the support, why would anyone believe little old me, right? That my neighbor did this, or my cousin did this, or my old boyfriend did this to me. And so there is this crisis of belief in the system that we need the people in the Jeffrey Epstein cases to be held accountable for just that reason, just as a start.
So what can we be doing better? The law enforcement community, social groups, activists, what works? You mentioned this really cool concept that's been implemented in Arizona, the no arrest nights, where you encounter people at street level, and either they think they're about to be arrested, or you just approach them on street nights and offer services. What else is going on that you've seen work better?
So what we know about trafficking is we've tried a bunch of things. We've tried arresting victims. We've tried to, coerce them into maybe leaving an area, right? There's a lot of pressure in our community to get off of our prostitution track. And so arresting people is one of the ways that law enforcement says, like, just get out of here, like, go somewhere else. We don't want you here. We don't want kids to see you here. And so that is such a limited idea of arresting your way out of this prostitution problem, because they're not the only person involved, right? They get arrested, they go to jail, they come out the next day, and their trafficker says to them, you owe me $650 from yesterday and today. You got to go back out there. So they have to work twice as hard to not get beaten by that trafficker. So the most important thing for me is to be innovative, to really think outside the box. So the things that we do in our community is, one, our state legislature gave us money to start a human trafficking hotline just for our state. It's manned by survivor leaders, a native Spanish speaker. And the idea is that if you talk to someone who's experienced something similar to you, maybe you feel heard and listened to a little bit differently. We also, from our state police, got resources for them. So everybody wants a nice hug from a nice social worker. I am very nice. But what they really need is resources to get out of that situation. So can I get them a plane ticket to go back to where they're safe? Can I help pay their rent this month so they don't get evicted with their children? Can I help get their teeth fixed so they can get a better job? And so our state police, Arizona Department of Public Safety, has been really smart about resources for our hotline. So that's one of our biggest innovations. Think differently. Why have a state hotline? Because we're right here. We know every county and every community. And so your listeners know what's happening in your community, know who are the helpers, know how to help them if they need resources, money, toothbrushes, support, food for dinner at night. So those are some of the things that we do. Other things that we're doing is we have something called the Coaster Project, where we have coasters that we're giving out at bars and clubs with our human trafficking hotline on it. And our job is to educate those bar managers and supervisors at bars, wait staff, to look for trafficking. That if we can build an army of people who are knowledgeable about trafficking, victims will be heard and seen differently. Like, hey girl, are you okay? Or hey, hey guy, you look like maybe you're uncomfortable. Is there anything I can do for you? Do you know about this hotline? So the Coaster Project is an educational opportunity to learn about trafficking, but also hand out these coasters at bars and clubs in our community. Other things that we do those non-arrest nights with law enforcement once a month. We have our beautiful housing program, Phoenix Starfish Place, that is a safe, loving, supportive program for 2 years, where women live in the most beautiful apartments you've ever seen with their children. We also have other projects. We have a new one called Athletes Against Trafficking. So trying to get the athlete community, whether it's high school, college, professional, to realize that trafficking happens in their community, whether it's by their coaches, whether the other girls or boys on their team are vulnerable. So it's really just surrounding people by knowledge, making sure that someone on every team, someone on every advocacy group is looking for trafficking. And then this last weekend, we just finished our really exciting one called Be the Man. And that's a new program giving men tools to be accountable to protect girls and women. So having discussions about integrity, discipline, character development, and also protecting girls and women. And actually, it's being led by formerly incarcerated men to currently incarcerated men, saying, listen, you can change who you are just because of the things that have happened in your life and the choices you've made in the past. You can move forward as a better man. And so that'll be rolling out in the next couple months. So innovation is the name of the game in a problem like this that's really entrenched in our belief that you can buy sex from someone else and there's no risk or no harm. That is such a myth.
You really have put legs on the problem. It is trouble. It's a massive troubleshooting and creative thinking problem. And you clearly think outside the box. For folks who don't know or haven't read my book, Long Haul, I visited Starfish Place in Phoenix, Arizona, and it still has left an imprint on me to see these young women. And it's a place for young women who are leaving trafficking, who have young children, and to see those kids running around playing, and then the women getting educated on what they need for resume building, training, education, and they're excited about it. It truly made an imprint on me. And Sean, if we could put up the Starfish Project screen, if people want to. That's the school prevention.
Well, I can talk about the school prevention project if you want.
Yeah, I do, but I want to because that gets into proactive early intervention. But yeah, folks, find starfishpartnership.org if you want to help out and provide some funding at Starfish Partnership. I'm telling you, it's amazing. And yeah, tell us about early intervention of at-risk groups and what's the school intervention project is about.
Sure. The idea is that if you take the power away from the trafficker, the lure that the trafficker offers, if someone like you, Frank, or me sits down with our teenagers and say, listen, someone's going to come to you and they're going to tell you they're going to solve all your problems. They're going to get you everything you've ever wanted. They're going to take you around the world. You're going to live a glamorous life. And if we tell them that, they're like, what are you talking about? And so our idea is that parents, schools, school personnel, coaches should be the purveyors of this knowledge, that we can't count on on the media, right? Jeffrey Epstein's bigger than most families can understand, right? It's hard to look at the risk for your own daughter or your own son in your own house using such a big concept. So the idea is that teachers have this language of awareness. They have a kiddo who comes to their school. She's got a purse that maybe she shouldn't have, or a second phone. When her purse falls, maybe some condoms fall out. Those are things that should be concerning, and maybe have a conversation privately with them. For parents, I have a 15-year-old daughter and a 17-year-old son. We talk about things like consent, but we also talk about sextortion, that if someone asks you for a picture of you naked, or sends you a picture of them naked, doesn't mean that that's not a predator. And so building awareness for kids so they have their own tools to be safe. And really what we do is we give kids tools to keep each other safe. So instead of me coming to them and saying, you have to tell an adult if this happens, what we want them to do is tell their best friend, who then knows what adult to tell. And so that best friend is like, man, where did you get those? Did that guy really give you his car? Did he really give you, tickets to something? You're 13. Like, what's this 25-year-old guy wanting to spend time with you? Let's tell our mom, right? Let's talk to the people that care about us.
For
And
sure.
what we know about victims is we have law enforcement's daughters, we have judges' daughters. We got a tip to our hotline recently. It was an emergency room doctor. And we were like, oh, this is going to be a client in the emergency room. Absolutely not. It was her 21-year-old daughter who had just left a sober living program and she thought was being trafficked, and how could we help? And so it's so much bigger. It's such a big spectrum of victims that it's really hard to put it in a quick and easy prevention pool. That earlier intervention, that early awareness is really important for us to kind of broaden our minds about.
Yeah, for sure. We're not having enough candid discussions with our kids and grandkids. And you have found an at-risk population through hundreds of interviews and working with hundreds of victims that involved the schools, but particularly at young men and women who have in some way touched special education. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. So kids in special education, adults in special education, it's about 22% over and over and over in our research that people who report being sex trafficked have been in special education. So what would make a person in a special education environment be more vulnerable to a trafficker? So some of those things are maybe they're naive, maybe they don't perceive the situation like maybe a kid who had different cognition levels. Maybe the parents are worried more about their survival and functioning as opposed to protecting them from predators, right? Maybe that's far down the list. Traffickers are pretty smart. They're going to find someone who might not be very believable on the stand, right? That if they went to law enforcement, maybe they wouldn't be believed. And so there's all of that combination that makes them extra vulnerable. And so what we do is we train people on every team, and an IEP team, a 504 team. We want someone in that room to be like, why does that kid have these things, right? Things that they shouldn't have, are going places, seem tired in class, dressing differently. They see the warning signs, they bring it to the administration and the parents, and that's what our warning system should look like.
Yeah, if you've got a friend or relative in teaching, you should check out Dr. Roe-Sepowitz's work on school intervention for sure. All right, we've talked a lot about the supply side of this economic equation. Let's talk about the demand side. And you hinted at it with Be the Man and Athletes Against Trafficking.
Right.
But what is going on to reduce the demand for sex for money?
So we just did a study last year where we interviewed 20 men about their first sex buying experience. We gave them a lunch ticket, a gift card, and we were pretty nice to them. They were in a diversion program. So in the city of Phoenix, if you are caught trying to buy sex, usually from an undercover, you go to a one-day diversion program. And so the things that they said were really interesting, trying to understand how a person believes that buying another person for sex has like equanimity, like they're equals, right? They're not better. They don't have power over that other person. It is really nonsense. The person with money has the power. And what we find is in those stories and many, many other, I have 35,000 calls during those Super Bowl events, 35,000 calls from sex buyers calling to make my day. I always make a joke that my husband's name is Brian, and I get hundreds of calls from Brian's trying to make my day. And then any friend of mine or any colleague who's like, oh, Frank called last night and said he was gonna. So thousands of sex buyers have called our ads. So
you, just to be clear for our viewers, you're placing ads deliberately for sex.
Yep.
To see who responds and what the circumstances are.
Yep. So we wanted to know what time they called, what they said when they called. We did have one guy out of Chicago who was like, I'm going to put you in my dungeon and tie you up. And we were like, Chicago Police Department, here's some information for you. But the rest of those 35,000 are, all over the country, right? We did it in Kansas City and Orlando and New York and in Hawaii. And people were like, hey, I'm a surfer in this little town. You want you want to come hang out. And really this idea that it's like buying a soda, right? Like it's not a big deal. This is not, I don't have to be clandestine because law enforcement is not looking for me. In most cities in America, sex buyers are not held accountable for their behavior. There is no enforcement by law enforcement. It's a misdemeanor, right? We got bigger crimes with low law enforcement numbers. Are you going to have people go into strip clubs looking for, illegal activity? Are you going to have people go, pose as a person selling sex and try to get those johns? It's really about the community and whether or not they believe that's important. So in our study of 20 guys, we learned a couple of really important things. One, a lot of them learned about that sex buying behavior from their family, from their dad, from their cousin. One guy talked about going to a strip club. His dad gave him $100 and said, go have fun, right? That's how it began. Others talked about it being a total secret. No one knew what they were doing. But other people talked about, like the boys, they talked about it all the time, like what that girl's body was like and what it felt like, and was she responsive enough? And so there's a big diversity of sex buyers. Other things we learned is that people tend to think about it before they bought. So a gentleman talked about driving down the street and a woman leaning in his window saying like, hey, for $200, I'll do this. And he didn't have $200 and he drove away. For 3 weeks, he thought about it. He saved up his $200 and then he went back and bought sex. And then he bought sex every week for 2 years before he got caught. And so as we approach sex buyers, they're so different economically, racially, background. There's not one type of man who buys sex. So how do we intervene? Is it shaming them? Is it putting their name up on a billboard? We don't think that works very well. Is it charging them $5,000? Maybe that feels a little different. Is it writing letters home so their wife sees what happened? It's really complicated. How do you get people to change the way they think and feel about buying sex is really hard to do. That's why we think Be the Man Project is a really great place to start, right? Help building integrity and character, that buying sex would be against my whole belief system. If my whole belief system was protecting girls and women, buying sex from them would violate that. So how do we teach young boys and men about being protectors? And I think that's really one of our only approaches. We really have lots of science to learn. We've got to do better around sex buyers.
I do think you're onto something with reaching young boys as early as possible with the concepts, not age appropriate concepts of being protectors, being respectful. And then for guys in adulthood, the education sounds important too. Look, this person you're doing a transaction with is a victim. This is not Julia Roberts, my friend. This is a trafficking victim. Yeah.
And it's not sexy to think that, right? It's not attractive. And when we've surveyed men over the years, some of their answers were fascinating, right? They were attracted to someone that didn't look like their wife, right? And they thought buying it was sort of equal, like they weren't hurting anyone. Or if their wife didn't know, it wasn't a violation of their marriage covenant, right? There are all these myths that people tell themselves so they have permission to do it. I did a study about 10 years ago with a really, really interesting research team. We did a list matching study where we asked a generalizable group of men if they had bought sex in the last 3 years, and it was 4%. Almost 4 million people reported that they had bought sex in the last 3 years. These were all men. And so what can we do to intervene? How do we as a community say, we don't think sex buying is good for families, is good for our communities? How do we help people broaden their understanding that women in strip clubs are almost always trafficked, right? That's a gateway straight into trafficking. If you're working in a strip club, you're paying a pole fee, you're paying security, the DJ, the bartenders, everyone there is making money off of you. Oftentimes you have to leave and sell sex in addition just to make even that night. So again, another thing that we've kind of glorified, that strippers make tons of money, they're buying their way through college. That is not what we see. We see people stuck in this economic cycle where they make just enough and then someone takes it from them. That's the manager or their boyfriend or their trafficker.
A colleague of yours across the country, Dr. Celia Williamson at University of Toledo, who I also was fortunate enough to work with on my book. She really destroyed the myth of the legal brothels in Nevada. and that, oh, well, at least it's a couple of counties where it's legal. And she said, those women are also being trafficked. They've got the pimp or the boyfriends back home who they're sending their money to. And I thought, okay, I didn't know that. That's it's all part of that education process.
So what we've learned from our work with the Las Vegas Metro Police Department, that payday in those very few brothels, I think there are 19 left in those counties, about an hour and a half outside of Las Vegas. On Tuesdays is payday, and those traffickers drive up and go get those paychecks from those girls. So it's pretty transparent. We just have this idea that in our world, men can buy women, like that if we take that myth away, really what it looks like is women who don't have the things they need to be successful in other situations, right? They might have mental health problems or substance use problems or been abused as a child. If they can't be successful somewhere else, this is the last opportunity they have. And that's acceptable to men, right? That's acceptable that I'm buying sex from someone who's hurting, who's being beaten, who's forced into this. The mental gymnastics that men have to do to make it make sense to them is always really interesting to me, right? How do you convince yourself that this person with a black eye in front of you, or this young girl who really doesn't want to spend any time with you, right? How do you convince yourself that buying sex from her makes sense, or him, or they, of course, right? What's interesting about boys is boys and men is that, and trans person is, they're a completely different market, and we know far less about boy and male and trans victims. They're not sold on the same websites. They're not sold in the same bars and clubs or street areas. And so there's a whole other kind of field that we have to do work in to try to prevent that we haven't even started on.
For sure. What about, since so much of what happens in our society is economic, what about attacking or working with the platforms, the internet platforms, the platforms responsible for hosting the ads? I spoke along with a survivor. We spoke to a juvenile sex trafficking conference last year in Orlando. And I was like, hey, I'm here. I'm going to attend some classes myself. And so my eyes were opened about Instagram and the prostitution ads on Instagram, but everywhere else. And then also, of course, the icons, the emojis keep changing as to what is, what I knew what an eggplant stood for, but now there's a whole different slew of emojis that you need to know about if you have kids. And they're using those emojis because there's trafficking emojis. But what about the economics of going after platforms? I know, famously Backpage and all of that. What's going on with that effort?
Well, about the emojis and some of the language. So there's this pimp prostitution sort of lifestyle that has words to it that are pretty important, especially for law enforcement. Because if you get someone's phone and she or he or they say, I'm being trafficked, and you don't know what you're looking for, you're not gonna be able to interpret what is on that phone or what is on those social media posts. And so we've created a glossary of law enforcement terms so that law enforcement can use them in their arrest request and in their function of finding a trafficker responsible for being a trafficker. So that's one tool. Another amazing tool, there's this woman out of Multnomah County who has a tattoo library of trafficking tattoos. One of the biggest offenses that traffickers use in front of a jury is that they're not a trafficker. You can't prove it. It's just something she said. And so creating that scenario around that trafficking, showing, who rented the room, what happened, that social media. But if you can show a tattoo on a victim that is a trafficking tattoo, but also on the trafficker. So the most vivid trafficker tattoo I've ever seen was across a person's pectoral muscle, and it was two hands snapping a naked woman in half and money coming out of her girl parts. And underneath it, it says, I broke that bitch. And that is trafficking, right? So is the pirate's glove, a P for pimp, number 16304. There are certain things that law enforcement, our community should be knowing so they can look out for it and be able to write and convict traffickers using that kind of very, again, a little bit innovative, a little bit outside the box knowledge, right? He's not going to, or she's going to come forward and be like, yeah, I trafficked that person. They're going to say, oh, I'm a drug dealer. I'm just a batterer, right? I didn't do those things. And so it behooves us to educate our community about making sure. I want every jury in the world to know what a trafficking tattoo looks like, and they should see my glossary. They need to know what a meet is, right? A meet is a meeting of a sex buying customer, right? A date, right? They need to know that those linguistics.
Sure.
So I don't think I answered your question at all.
Well, it was the going after the big platforms who earn money from paid ads for sex.
It's been really tough. So after Backpage closed in 2018, and there were some really good convictions from that case, all of the sex selling specific ones are offshore. So problematic. They don't respond to subpoenas. They're really tough to work with. And then the platforms like Facebook and Instagram seem to have this protection against prosecution for it or responsibility. Interestingly, girls, programs that are being held responsible, we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of civil suits are against hotels. So there was some laws that passed that took away the protection from hotels and bars, right, and strip clubs. Those are coming. Where if a hotel knowingly allowed the trafficking of a child or an adult, that they're held financially responsible. And so we're seeing dozens and dozens of cases almost every week starting around that. But I'm
watching those.
Yeah.
I like those cases against the hotels, both independent franchisees and when they can prove the case, the actual corporate headquarters of the hotel. And at that conference I told you about that I was at last year, I met attorneys who were working those big cases, and they won an award at the conference for their work. It's astounding the amount of money that comes into a motel. We're not talking about necessarily flea bag motels, which goes all the way up to 4-star hotels. And the turning, the other way that the manager does when he knows there's trafficking going on in the hotel, because it brings in money. And then, even some evidence pointing to corporate headquarters saying, we be careful there. Yeah.
So what we're asking is for the community to be intolerant, that hotels shouldn't allow it. If you see it in your store, you shouldn't allow it. If you have kids come over and they're talking and joking about girls, that we shouldn't tolerate it, that our biggest challenge in the United States is that we allow trafficking to happen. It is allowed in every city and every town. And it's up to us to change that. We can stop that. We can intervene, we can prevent, we can become aware. We can tell hotels we don't allow it. We can tell hospitals you need to look for it. We have schools who should be aware, parents, and we have all this resistance to getting that information out, that schools are nervous about talking about it. Parents don't really think it's going to happen to their kid. And until we face as a community that this is our responsibility, that every time a person is sex trafficked in our country, that it is our fault, that we won't be able to do anything different. So I challenge your audience to intervene, to get in there, to donate money, to spend time volunteering. I know you have some incredible warriors
we do.
On this call. So
folks, listen, if you're intrigued by this and inspired by this conversation, be aware of what's going on in your community. Go ahead and research what the organizations are and volunteer, or simply give them some money. They need supplies and they need help. Sean, have we got any more screens that will help people connect? There's the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research at ASU, phenomenal program there. And look, Give Now button on the bottom left. There's Starfish and Starfish Place, where I visited as well. And boy, I'll be watching Be the Man and Athletes Against Trafficking. Have you got any big name athletes, professional athletes in the works?
No, we're just growing. I have some really amazing athletes that are on my staff, and so we're really trying to be homegrown and really approach it in a way that it's just a sisterhood or a brotherhood, right? We're going to protect the people on our team. We're going to protect the people around us. So we haven't really gone for those athletes yet. We're interested, but we know that starting small is always the best. So
that would be meaningful. Thanks for all you do, and And thanks for everybody who you help train up to do what you do as well. And folks, I hope you gleaned some things and some nuggets from this conversation. And maybe at least when you turn on the World Cup, you'll think, I wonder what that city's doing to fight trafficking. Dominique, thanks for joining us. And for folks who want to share this conversation with others, it'll be up on Substack and YouTube, and feel free to share. Thanks again. Keep up the good work.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Doctor.
Bye-bye.
Hey, folks, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And it's tough to use the word enjoy when the topic is as dark as that. But look, information is power. Knowledge is power. We got a little more informed today about a long-lasting problem in our society. We can only do a little bit with the environment in front of us, and that's all it takes, is everybody doing a little bit with what they've got. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on the Frank Figliuzzi Show. Thanks.